Hi, welcome to Let's Talk Careers. I'm your host, Lisa Bauman. Today I'm talking with Shermeen Khan. Shermeen is the manager of accessible learning services here at Conestoga. In our conversation, she shares her journey to leadership as a person with a visual impairment. Listen in as she shares her career advice with others who are also visually impaired. I hope you enjoy. So welcome, Shermeen. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm going to get you to start by introducing yourself, and you can say your name, your current role, and something that you're super passionate about.
My name is Shermeen Khan. I am the manager of the Accessible Learning Services Department at Conestoga College, and something I am passionate about. I am passionate about fragrances.
Fragrances. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later on.
Definitely. That'll be another episode.
Yeah, that could be an interesting episode. So I'm going to start by asking you, going back to early days, what did you want to be when you were growing up? Maybe even what was your first paid job? What did you do going to post-secondary? Maybe we can start sort of in that part.
Yeah, these are great questions. So when I was younger, it's interesting. I think for a lot of people, our first exposure to working professionals either tends to be kind of listening to what our parents are doing or learning about what our parents are doing at the dinner table. And often the first professional we're encountering on a regular basis are teachers.
Right.
And somehow I never thought I wanted to be a teacher, but I always thought it was fascinating that, that tends to be the profession we see the most as children.
Yeah.
I was very musically inclined as a child. I really enjoyed singing, and I became involved in choral music at a young age and really enjoyed that, and definitely wanted to become a singer when I grew up. My parents worked very hard to convince me that was a terrible idea.
Okay.
And that I would spend the rest of my life living in a car. And I'm blind and don't drive.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Yes.
And so
Gotcha.
The car was not going to be the issue, but I think over time, they kind of whittled down my dream. I'm making it sound like they were, very dispassionate, completely logical people who wanted to take all the joy out of life. But I think what I took from that is just that a career in music and particularly in performance would not have been a very linear career. Certainly, there would have been a lot of challenges. It's very difficult, I think, to make a sustainable living that way. Anyway, so when I was in high school, I thought I wanted to be a counselor of some kind, but I wasn't entirely sure. When I was doing my I'm going to back up a little bit.
That's okay.
Wanted to be a counselor of some kind in high school. My parents were very determined that I would be a lawyer. It was definitely a dream of theirs. And of course, as soon as it became a dream for them that I become a lawyer, I was like, the one career I will not do is law.
Okay.
And so I was very determined to, just to be a bit obstinate when it came to fulfilling their life dreams. So anyway, when I was in undergrad, I did my undergrad at Laurier in sociology. Which it's interesting because my parents were always a bit worried about, well, what door is that going to open? But, I think what's really hard is when you're 18, it's very difficult to know what you're going to want to do for the rest of your life. I mean, I'm in my, late 30s now, and I feel like I still don't know what I want to do with the rest of my life. So, yeah. Thought I wanted a job in counseling or a job that involved working with people or coaching people. In my final year of undergrad, I ended up taking a few law courses. One was a criminal law course taught by a then prosecutor, and a business law course, which was taught by a professional, like a corporate lawyer. And that kind of reignited my it made a lot of things come together. I've always valued connecting with people. And one thing that I would say has been a thread throughout the entirety of my career is I'm very fascinated by the concept of being fair and even-handed, and really looking at a situation from a variety of perspectives and really being able to identify your bias. And so after taking those two courses, I thought, you know what? I should apply to law school.
How did your parents feel?
They didn't know. I didn't tell them.
Okay.
No, because I thought there would be a lot riding on it. And what if I don't come in and I want to do this for myself? And so I wrote the LSAT. That's the law school admission test.
Yep.
Lots of logic questions, that kind of thing. And eventually I was accepted at the University of Ottawa.
Okay.
And when I got my acceptance, that's when I called my parents.
Okay.
And told them about it, and they were delighted and very surprised,
Okay.
but very happy as well. So that was a nice moment.
Okay.
And I think, as I grew older, irritating my parents kind of became a bit less. How would I say this? A little bit less exciting. So,
Okay.
Went to the University of Ottawa, finished my law degree, and then I articled in the area of family law. So articling is just when you work under the supervision of a lawyer for a year until you get called to the bar. Wrote the Ontario bar exam. That's 2 exams. There's a solicitor's exam and the barrister's exam.
Yeah.
Wrote those, got called to the bar, and so I am a lawyer.
Okay.
And I'm glad I did that. Afterwards, though, I kind of drifted around and wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do with myself. One of the things that I think people don't realize about law school is it doesn't necessarily funnel you into a particular kind of law. So most people, well, all people who complete law school, we graduate as generalists, which is a really good thing, honestly. To really pigeonhole yourself too early in any career feels probably not wise. A friend of mine let me know that there was a posting available at Conestoga College for an accessibility advisor in their accessibility services department. Okay. Now, one thing that may or may not be obvious is I'm blind. I've been blind my whole life. Okay. And so I have been a user of accessibility services at all the post-secondary institutions I've attended. And so being able to access an education that has, that has reduced barriers was a really significant part of why I've been able to be successful in any way. And so I thought that was it seemed like a very interesting role, and also just a really neat way to be on the other side of the desk. I think sometimes we really become used to being service users and often wonder what it would be like to be a provider of that service. And I thought that with having a lot of lived experience with disability and a good understanding of disability and risk management and risk mitigation and that type of thing, I thought I'd apply for the job. And I got it, which was like a huge game changer for me. And I think, there are those moments in our lives where you turn a corner, right? Something happens, somebody takes a chance on you, or they hire you for something, or you move somewhere and you realize now you've rounded a corner. And that was a rounded corner for me because it started my whole career at Conestoga. Yeah. Worked as an accessibility advisor for about 3 or 4 years. And then I eventually transitioned into being the manager of this department in 2018. And that's where I've been ever since.
Okay. How many years have you been with the college then?
So I've been with Conestoga College since 2015. I think August 2015.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So almost 10 years.
I know. Yeah, it's wild. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. What was it like going through either high school or post-secondary and thinking about the career choices that were in front of you as an individual who is blind? What did that look like?
What's interesting is that a blind teenager is just a teenager who's blind, right? And so I have to say, I wish I could say that as a teenager or as a young adult, I had a lot of awareness of accessibility barriers and I had so much wisdom about picking a career, and I didn't. And I would say that I similarly fell prey to just thinking about what am I interested in. People did not have those conversations with me. People didn't talk to me about, let's find a career that we know has some accessibility success in it. Let's find people who are already working in these fields and get you connected with them. So I definitely was motivated by what I was interested in. Now, what I will say is, as a blind person, I was already interested in things that blind people are good at because I was myself. And so I was interested in music, and I was interested in, therapy and that type of thing. So I was already sort of inclined. But what I would say, the pitfall of that is what you're interested in isn't actually the day in the life of anybody. And so that I would say was, I think in many ways I was a very typical teenager and young adult. What I would say is a few things. First, and I would say this is about 90% of the answer, I have been extremely privileged and blessed. I was born into a family that was like a middle class family with resources. I was educated at the TDSB in Toronto. That's a very well resourced school board. So when there were times when I was the only blind student in the school, which certainly had an impact on my upbringing, I had access to a lot of the resources that I needed to be successful. So I would say I was very lucky, and I was also very lucky that I was also very fortunate that I was academically successful from a young age, and I didn't choose to be that way. Like that I am the kind of person who kind of took to school, I think was not of my own making by any means. And so I think, the fact that I enjoyed reading and writing and talking and that type of thing, I feel very fortunate because I feel like in that sense, I kind of won the birth lottery or the blind lottery, because so many careers that will be accessible to blind people are ones where we can do a lot of thinking, right? They're not going to be the ones where we're doing a ton of like manual labor and touching lots of touch screens and, dealing with lots of devices and that kind of thing. So I was very fortunate. The other thing that I would say, though, that is uniquely determinative is that you can be as tenacious, as bold, as prepared as you want. But until you meet people who see the value that you bring to a situation, or people who actually think that your perspective is going to enhance their workplace, blindness is a very feared disability. I've heard people talk about fearing blindness more than fearing death. There are people who meet me who know that my husband and I are blind parents, and they'll often just say, like, how do you do it? And I think, well, that's not a very specific question. I don't know what to tell you. But
what do you mean?
How do I do what? You know what I mean? And it's, often it's, if you take that to its logical conclusion, there's such incredulity. And it's usually rooted in people feeling very humbled, which is kind of them. But the dark side of that is just like, if I were blind, like I couldn't handle it. I'd probably kill myself. I couldn't leave my house. And so, there's a dark side to that. So I think what I would say is it definitely takes encountering people who believe in difference, who believe in diversity, who can really see the value that you're going to bring somewhere, and who will take a chance on you. And that's why we named our second daughter. We combined the names of my and my husband's first boss, because those were the people who rocketed our lives into a whole different direction. Right. And we all have those people in our lives. Yeah, I love that. But it was that meaningful that we thought, you know what, we need to have this reflected in our lives in some way. And they'll be the unlikeliest of people. You wouldn't always be able to pick them out in a crowd.
So let me go back and ask you a couple of questions.
Yeah.
When you talked a little bit about in the articling position. Mm-hmm. How did you find that job?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I ended up articling in the area of family law. And finding articles is a bit like the Hunger Games. So when you're done law school, Everyone is kind of responsible for finding their own articling position. So there's definitely a hustling component to it. And there are multiple places to article. You can article with government, you can article with a small practitioner or a solo practitioner, or also with like at one of the large corporate firms. So you kind of hear the term like, they're a Bay Street lawyer. That's usually, a downtown legal professional. I ended up going to a few, like the Kitchener Bar had a number of events that brought together lawyers from a variety of backgrounds. And I ended up going to an event, and I remember just telling myself, Shermeen, meet as many people as you can, talk to people, make sure, be your most charming, outgoing self.
Okay.
Don't close your mind to any opportunity. And I kept reminding myself, you just need one. You just need one person to take you on. And I ended up finding somebody who is now actually a judge. But at the time she was a family law practitioner. And I ended up articling with her for a year. It was a good experience. It was sobering in many ways. It was during my articling year that I realized how inaccessible the area of family law is if you are blind. And I had originally thought, it's going to be a more accessible area of the law because so much of it involves things that I am very comfortable with, which would be, relating to people, talking to people, interviewing. There's, a quasi counseling element to family law. What I was not prepared for was that there were so many forms. There was very industry specific software, financial statements, lots of, pensions and benefits and that type of thing. Now, this isn't to say that if I had persisted, I think, through a combination of hopefully being resourceful and connecting with other blind family lawyers, it's certainly possible. And there are lawyers who are blind who are working in all over the legal field. But I definitely found that to be incredibly discouraging, especially starting out. There's a confidence you develop as you move through your career and you kind of amass experience and you think, okay, at this stage in my career, I can think of a variety of ways that I might solve any given issue. Or having worked in leadership, I've really been able to harness the ability to delegate appropriately. Right. But this would not have occurred to me as an articling student, and nor would it have been, I think, appropriate really at that time. Right. So it was a very it was a positive experience in that I enjoyed the substantive work. But very discouraging because I thought, oh my goodness, this is not going to be an accessible field for me. What have I gone and done? Yeah, definitely. And then the position that you found at the college, you said a friend showed you the position or alerted you to the position that it was open. Yeah. What was that process look like in terms of applying for the role and coming in through the interview process? What was that? So he sent me the position, and I will be forever grateful to him because some people are very good at being all over all the job boards, and they get, they're subscribing to feeds and things like that. So he alerted me to the position, and I thought, oh my goodness, I could actually do this. There was a sense of there are so many jobs where I think, especially when you're starting out in your career and you think, I don't know if I'm even qualified. Like, look at 80% of the job description and I think there's no way I could do this. But I thought, no, I think I could actually do this. And I was hopeful that there would be a desire on the part of the college to recognize the value in lived experience. And to see that reflected in the staff, I thought would be really neat if I could be given that opportunity. So the interview itself, I prepared for it probably harder than I've prepared for anything in my life. I did a mock interview. I actually reached back out to the folks at the career services at Laurier because as an alum, I think you have access to support from them for basically forever. So I do take advantage of that and will randomly reach out to them for perspective. So with them, I did a mock interview. They helped with, identifying things that I want to talk about, things I want to showcase, relating all my answers back to the job in some way, or relating all my life experience back to the job. Anyway, I attended the interview. I think the interview was supposed to be an hour, and we talked for an hour and a half.
Wow.
And what I will say about the interview is, at the end of it, at the end of the interview, I felt so exhausted. And I felt like I had given every ounce of myself to this interview. Like, I thought, you may not get this job, Shermeen, but it won't be because you didn't give 100% of yourself in this application. And so I did. I made sure my references were in order. And then that was on a Friday. And then on the following Monday, I was followed up, HR followed up with me to ask about references. And so I was hopeful, at least at that point, but, not even close to being really optimistic. And then I think it was like Friday, July 15th at 1:52 p.m.
You remember the time.
I remember it 100 because my life changed.
Yes. Wow.
My life changed. And so the phone rang, and I noticed that it was a number that was local to the area, and I thought, okay, like, I've been waiting for my phone to ring for so long. And it was Carolyn Galvin. And the reason I mention this is because she's now I don't know, I think she's like a senior VP of HR and all sorts of things anyway. But at that time, she was, I don't even know what they called them. The people who call you to tell you.
Business partner, I think.
Business partner, yeah, or HR advisor.
Yep.
And it was she who called me to tell me about the job. And she's like, and there's a good pension plan. And my brain was spinning because all I heard was, the job is yours. So that's what that was like. It was a whirlwind. And my life rounded a corner.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And so you were in the role as advisor for, you said, I think 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before you moved into the position for manager position. That's okay. What was that like in terms of making the decision to move from the advisor role into the manager role?
Yeah, I had enjoyed working as an advisor. And so the accessibility advisor is a person who determines the appropriate academic accommodations for students with permanent or temporary disabilities. So I had a caseload. I was meeting with students regularly, and it was great. I really enjoyed being student facing. And then I had actually been approached about the management position when it became available. I don't know that I think what I would say now is, if I hadn't been approached, I don't think I would have applied on my own. And I think it was largely just because I just come back from mat leave. I just had our first baby girl. And I just thought, I'm not ready. Like it wouldn't have occurred to me, I don't think. But I remember when it was the director at the time who approached me about that position. And I remember I went home to my husband and just burst into tears because I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not ready. Like it was overwhelming in the best possible way. I mean, certainly I was so flattered that anybody thought I had leadership capability and that that I might be a good fit for the role. So that alone was just mind blowing to me. And then sort of though thinking about what it would be like from moving from peer to supervisor, and that's an incredibly challenging transition, I would say, for anybody. So it was definitely, I would say, a very scary experience. The whole transition, I think, was very scary. And I think took at least a year, if not longer, to really feel comfortable identifying as a leader in this department and not, because I think, it's not like you flip a switch and then one day, now you're the manager and yesterday you were a colleague, but having a foot in both worlds was really hard, because it was also very important to me to retain the quality of the relationships that I'd established with my peers. And I wanted to continue to be approachable and friendly and interesting, and was also, though, made aware of the fact that, there are boundaries end up having to be really important. And I would say boundaries in general, and I know it's a buzz term because everyone's talking about boundaries right now. Yeah. I think they're especially important in a leadership position. And I would say probably something that I continue to struggle with, if I'm being completely honest. So yeah, a very challenging transition, but I think I was definitely supported, which made a big difference.
Yeah. So on that note, actually, in terms of support, some folks find having mentors or even mentoring others, a kind of a helpful stage in terms of their own career journey. Did you have any mentors along the way, or have you done any mentoring with other folks around, careers and things like that?
Yeah, that's a good question about mentors. And actually, you're going to ask me another question later about mentors, it wasn't about mentors. It was about what I would do differently. So what I will say is I really valued the mentorship of the then director, who unfortunately didn't stay at the college much longer. But I valued the rapport we established so much. And what I will say about a good mentor is that they will be a person to whom you can talk to about hard things and speak in a very candid way without a lot of filters. And the value they bring is obviously their wisdom, their experience, and the fact that they're, further along the journey. And so that has certainly been instrumental to me. What I would say is I'm definitely at a point in my career where I am looking for another mentor. And now I would say the focus is that I'd like to find a blind mentor who's further along in their career than I am. And I say that because there is a very unique relationship between having a disability and being at work. And I would take that further in leadership. It's particularly, how do I say this? Being a disabled leader has challenges. Being a disabled leader has psychological and dignity-related challenges that I don't think I experienced as much when I wasn't in leadership.
Right.
If I'm completely candid, I don't think I've handled a lot of it very well. And so I think if I could have done something differently, I would have found a disabled mentor earlier on in my career. Yeah. But it's never too late to find a mentor. Yeah. And so that's certainly something I want to do.
Yeah, let's do a shout out and see if we can find someone for you.
That's right.
Because I was going to say, how do you find one?
That's exactly right.
How do you find one?
Exactly. No, it's a good question, right? And I think it's finding a mentor is a very, it's a very word of mouth sort of who knows who works where. And not every disabled person in leadership would make a good mentor, right? And so fit is a really big part of it, and your value system, and that type of thing. So yeah, I think certainly but I would definitely consider my supervisor now, who's the director of student advising, accessibility, and testing, would definitely consider him a current mentor. So that's great. Like I definitely feel supported, and have had the opportunity, I would say, to informally mentor people. And I would say that is one of the aspects of leadership I enjoy a lot, is the mentoring relationship that I have tried to establish with at least some of the people on my team.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask another question here. What does a day in the life look like for you in terms of, you can even go from like life, home life, down into the work and then back to home life again. Yeah. Yeah. What does that look like?
Day in the life. Okay. So waking up, I don't need an alarm anymore because I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. Nice. And so that's kind of built in. Yeah. And so between my husband and I, we get the kids sorted out and ready to go in their various directions, get the guide dogs, because my husband is blind as well and also has a guide dog. So precious, I know. Anyway, get the guide dogs fed and relieved and ready, get ourselves ready, and get everyone out of doors to their various locations. And then I'm either working virtually or remotely. What is a typical workday will almost always involve at least a few one-on-one meetings that have been pre-scheduled to happen at regular intervals with people on my team. And in those meetings, what we tend to do a lot is troubleshoot tricky accommodation issues. One of the challenging and I would say exciting parts of working in this area, in this industry at all, is that there really isn't a manual. There isn't a guidebook around what accommodation would fit what issue. And then you throw in the fact that this is an area of applied learning. And so the learning environment, the academic environment is so varied. And there's an experiential component, there's labs, and so really sometimes figuring out how to support a student and also make sure that the essential learning outcomes of the course can still be attempted is always it's very interesting. And I the good news is I don't think we've not reached the end of knowledge on how to do that yet. So
nice.
So I would say that's a lot of the work that we do one-on-one with the advisors. We can generally anticipate that there will be some sort of student fire. So that looks like receiving a very long email thread or four with a lot of people copied and then adding in more people. And it may involve a student who's been very unhappy with their accommodations, or maybe they're unhappy with the fact that they don't have accommodations yet and they need accommodations and they're potentially getting different answers from people. And then the chair and I need to get on the phone and try to figure out, okay, wait, let's do some damage control. Let's de-escalate. Let's pull apart this situation and really isolate the things that we can actually address. It can sometimes involve, and then there's all the work that we do in terms of making sure that our department has sound processes and procedures. What else would I do in a typical day? I try, if I'm at home, to get in a workout on my Peloton.
Oh, good for you.
Always a ton of fun. Yep.
So the bike?
Yep. And they are accessible for people who are blind. So I feel
Amazing.
like that's an important thing to highlight about that.
Amazing.
Very good. What else happens? Yeah, and I would say often a part of my day involves connecting with other areas of the college. And sometimes that's about making sure we are making more robust, informed referrals to one another. And sometimes it's about jointly troubleshooting an accommodation issue or figuring out how to collaborate. That type of thing. We work very closely with the learning services team in the library, also with counseling and with testing and with the student success advisor. So in and among those teams, there's almost always something to be some project we're working on. Currently, we're resurrecting the accommodation process for students with an experiential learning component to their academic journey. So that's been really exciting.
Yeah. Do you want to give me an example of what that might look like?
Yeah. So we have students, for example, who are on various placements. So some accommodations that we might encounter there might be that if a student has a disability that might restrict their ability to travel to certain locations or to drive, they may need we may need to be very intentional about selecting a placement that they can access more easily. We have had students who have had needs for various types of software or hardware, or that the physical environment might need to be constructed in such a way. So for those students, for example, we might be more intentional about helping them identify a placement at an organization that is resourced enough already, where those accommodations might already be part of the built environment. So we think about people in the health office administration and potentially helping them find placements in hospital settings, as opposed to, a very small rural community clinic or things like that. We have students who may need to have feedback on their placements given verbally, or maybe they just need the feedback in writing. Maybe they need the feedback shared in multiple ways, or they need to debrief regularly with somebody, or maybe they need to take more breaks. Sometimes we have students who need to have do their placement over a slightly longer period of time. Yeah.
Thinking about sort of the day in the life, you must deal with a gigantic range of accessibility requests or accommodations. Maybe you can describe sort of what that spectrum looks like, so that if an individual is thinking about kind of coming into this field, they might have a bit of a sense of, what they might be prepared to support with.
Yeah. So the accessibility advisors work with, I would say, an almost limitless range of students with disabilities. And one of the ways in which I would say the industry has evolved tremendously, even in the last, I would say, decade or so, it's certainly exploded with the growth of social media and that type of thing. But disability doesn't look the way we thought it once looked. So,
right.
Back in the day, disability probably looked very physical. You'd see somebody who had a mobility related disability, or they were blind, or they were deaf. One of the things that we have become increasingly aware of is invisible disabilities, whether those are learning disabilities, ADHD. We have a lot of students with autism at the college as well. And actually, remarkably, we do have, not always, but I would say we sometimes have a lot of success with students who are deafened, or hard of hearing, because a lot of the physical jobs tend to be more accessible for people who experience hearing loss or who are deaf. So I thought that was kind of neat as well. So we work with students to develop an academic accommodation plan, and academic accommodations can typically be divided into two categories. There's the classroom accommodations. Those can sometimes involve things like note takers, having a support person accompany a student to class if that's needed. Sometimes it's preferential seating, being able to take pictures of posted notes or the blackboard. That type of thing, being able to record lectures. And then there's testing accommodations. And those are any accommodations that apply to assessments. That has historically meant things like, additional time sometimes, although we're realizing that sometimes additional time is helpful, sometimes it's not. Having your test or your materials available in a different format, potentially writing your test in a separate location, using adaptive technology. And that's another really big area of the college where if a student, and it's really quite encouraging when you meet a student who is newer to understanding their disability and they meet with somebody in our adaptive tech lab and learn about the range of tech that exists that can support people. And what's really exciting is that a lot of adaptive tech is becoming ubiquitous, right? You think of all the people like talking at Siri and into their phones and that kind of thing. So that a lot of adaptive tech is going mainstream is a really, really good thing. And so that's another way in which we support at the college as well.
Yeah. Awesome. That's awesome. So another buzzword, we were talking about buzzwords earlier, another buzzword that's sort of going around, and I'm not even sure how I feel about this buzzword because I feel like there's sort of a season for things, is work-life balance, right? You're in the season of having little people, which has another big demand on, on life.
That's another work. Yeah,
that's another work for sure. I'm a mom of 3, and mine are much older, so I feel like I'm in a totally different season. But how do you find, balancing all of the commitments that we have to do as workers, as moms, as
It's interesting. It's interesting you talked about work-life balance being a buzzword, and it always makes me think, what's a trend and what's progress? And often I think what we tend to do is we take a really good idea and then take it to its, very extreme end. But what I will say is so it's exciting. And I know the pandemic really made a lot of us tune into the concept of work-life balance a lot more. What I will say is that I don't experience my job as uniquely onerous on my time or energy. I really find that it's an appropriate, it's a manageable, it's taking a manageable amount of my time and energy. And one of the things that really helps that is when you see that reflected in your own superiors. If I'm not receiving emails in the middle of the night or on the weekend, I'm not going to think that that's what I need to do. And a lot of leaders are really good at saying, no, don't do as I do, you know, you don't need to do it because I'm doing it. But I think it's so important to be just so sensitive to those unspoken things that are nevertheless really affecting the climate at work. So I would say that. The other thing though that I would say, and I have to figure out how to word this though, is I value my work. I really love the people I work with. I would not say that work is something that would subsume my entire identity. And I don't want it to. And so I think, you know, it's interesting because a lot of the career advice you'll hear people say, or a lot of the sort of like pithy advice is like, find your passion. And I have my own thoughts about that. One of the things I would say, though, is that sometimes actually, if you are working in an industry that you're uniquely passionate about, you're more susceptible to being sucked in and sort of never released. And so I think, you know, it's I care about the work and I care very much about the people. And I would also not say that, you know, being an employee or being in this position is, you know, uniquely overtaking my identity. So fortunately, I don't think I need to really go out of and I feel like I'm also naturally a bit of a lazy person.
Okay.
So like,
that's fair.
I don't think I was ever prone to being a workaholic. Okay. Lazy might not be the right word, but I think I'm not, I'm not a workaholic. I believe in working hard and I believe in the quality of work. Yeah. But I'm not going to be, you know, burning the midnight oil like, you know, all week. Yeah.
That's beautiful. So let's go there. Tell me more about what your thoughts are on that sort of pithy comment about finding your passion.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Okay. I think what I will say is how I would reframe that if I were to try to give people advice around this concept of passion and that type of thing, I would say find a career that does not create moral conflict within you or moral dissonance or ethical dissonance. Passion, I think, is fickle. Like, I think our passions ebb and flow. And I think our passions can really inspire very large emotions in us. And I think sometimes our emotions can also cloud our judgment and really impact our ability to be impartial when we need to be, unbiased when we need to be, not uniquely wedded to a particular outcome. So I like the idea of finding a career that you enjoy, or finding a career where you feel you can improve the human experience even in your tiny little corner of the world, you know, one little bit at a time. Yeah. But I would say in terms of passion, I probably, that's not the advice I would give my children. Okay. I think I would certainly want their interests to inform their career. Right. Passion is, but I don't know, maybe I'm not, you know what? I've also realized, Lisa, over the course of my career, I've definitely noticed myself becoming more cynical and curmudgeonly and jaded. So
I don't see that at all. I don't see that at all. What advice would you give your kiddos? They're pretty little.
Yeah. You know, I think the advice I would give my kids, especially at this time, is the value of developing really good habits. I think that's a train I can get on, and probably not a train I got on early enough in life. I think what happened for me is that I was conventionally academically successful pretty early on. And, you know, I was an articulate child, and, you know, was pretty outgoing. And so I kind of rode the wave of aptitude. But eventually that wave will crest and you'll eventually get deposited in a group of people that are more capable than you or smarter than you, or who've certainly. And so I would say, you know, we really want, yes, aptitude is valuable, but what you can always count on is ethic and discipline. Someone said, you know, if you wait for motivation, like that jerk is always late, gotcha. Right? And so our motivation alone, I think, is never going to really fuel where we end up, and certainly not in a long sense. It'll kind of like give your batteries a rev, you know, it'll rev your batteries up a bit. So you hear an inspirational speaker and you're like, you know, and then 2 days later, you'll try to explain to somebody what they were talking about. And you're just so jazzed up, but the other person's like, Yeah, that's nice. Yeah,
Great.
you had a great experience. So I think that would be my advice is really try to develop good habits, but also I think, and sorry, this is where you warned me that I would, get on a tangent. I think one of the things that I'm really wanting to do with our kids is not to overprotect them in the physical world and to deeply protect them in the digital world. And so why this relates to what you're talking about is because I really want to encourage them to join things and to be parts of things and to not exclusively have one friend group at school, right? And so to, be involved in different areas, whether that's, I don't know, your church or a community group or a choir. So that would be my advice.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's go to the digital piece because you brought it up. And I think it's a kind of a critical piece because there's a lot of talk about AI, lot of talk about AI. What do you think AI is going to do in terms of your work and maybe even your life? Sort of the things that you do.
It's so hard. I think I feel like I should have given this more thought. I remain largely unworried about AI's impact in the world of accommodations and disability interventions and that type of thing. Because what AI can't do is think. And so that's what we need to do more than anything else in our field. And what AI can't do is figure out how not to give somebody some in-person news in a way that doesn't offend their dignity, or how to de-escalate a parent who's calling you on the phone and threatening with lawsuits and media action and that kind of thing. So I think in a large sense, I remain optimistic that it's not going to uniquely level this industry. What I will say, though, is that AI has been very valuable for people who are blind because there has been a lot of work done to develop apps that will describe things to blind people, describe photographs, describe the environment, and this ability has existed for a long time, but what's neat about the AI is that you can talk back to it. So, and you can talk back to it like a person. So if I feed my AI app a picture that someone has sent me, not only will it give me a description of it, but I can ask it questions that I probably wouldn't ask other people who I'm not close to.
I see.
Can you describe this person's build? Right. Things like that, the kind of thing that we might all kind of want to know, but have no really good business reason for asking. Right. And really to be able to describe something to a blind person in a way that's actually relevant, interesting, and meaningful, rather than just being like, there are 3 chairs and a wall. But that's nice, but it's not interesting. You're not telling me anything about, the vibe in this room. Or something like that. So I think I actually see AI as a really useful development in a lot of ways. Where I think we're going to find a lot of challenge, though, is obviously with academic integrity and that type of thing. Yeah. But so far, I think we've actually just been enjoying playing around with it.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to, and let's do some groups of people here. What advice would you give to, let's say, faculty? It's too broad, eh?
A little bit, but you know what? I mean, so I work with faculty a lot who have a wide variety of perspectives on the accommodation process, right? And I think they're not wrong in that the whole industry of supporting people with disabilities has evolved so much and so rapidly that faculty, who may have in their mind one concept of how disability tends to manifest, may not be as familiar with the ways in which disability manifests now and how it intersects really heavily with the mental health crisis that people are experiencing and that type of thing. So I think I would say to faculty or to anybody, to anybody, honestly, is always, always, always be prepared to change your mind. I think that's been such a meaningful way. That's been such a meaningful lens through which to view my life, to not be too wedded ideologically to anything, or to any particular outcome, and to really be able to change your mind on something, because it means that you're capable of evolving your thinking, right? If you can change your mind, you can change anything. And so that's what I would say to almost anybody, but is be prepared to change your mind.
Yeah. All right. What about giving advice to other students who are blind in terms of navigating their career?
Yeah. I would say then, so to people who are blind, I have very different advice than what I would have for people who are not blind.
Yeah.
But I would say to think very carefully about the kind of life you want, and think very carefully about the kinds of battles you want to undertake. It is possible, and has been done, to be the first blind person in any field, and to break down barriers, and to, change the narrative. And it's also okay if you don't have the energy or the desire to be that person, right? And so if you kind of think about the kind of, like, I knew for me, I wanted a life where I could get married and have kids and drink red wine and buy fragrances and, read lots of books and meet really great people and have really good conversations. And for me, that wouldn't have necessarily involved being a change maker in a massive sense, or, being the first blind pilot, or, whatever. And that's fine if that's what people want to do.
Yeah.
But I think there can be some really damaging advice given to blind people, especially blind children, in whom there's perceived to be a lot of potential. The sky's the limit. You can do anything you want. Right. If you put your mind to it, you can do whatever you want. And that's actually not true. Yes. And what I would say to blind people, that's different from other populations, is that we can't just fall back on other random jobs to make ends meet. Like, if things don't work out, I can't just go work at Home Depot or, I don't know, Susie Shear or whatever. And so to really think about the accessibility of your career, find people doing that kind of work, speak to them, find out what their life is actually like, and use that to inform your decision. I don't want to be career limiting. I don't want to be perceived as that. But I also know that I also know that blind people are the most educated, underemployed, disabled population. And I wonder if being able to have our expectations managed, or to really have honest conversations early on. I met a family lawyer who is blind for dinner after I was done articling, and he sat with me, and he was towards the end of his career. And I'll never forget what he said to me. And he said, "Shermeen, if I had known then what I know now, I never would have gone into family law. I've had to deal with so many accessibility barriers, and I wouldn't wish them on anybody else." Right. And just having graduated law school and completed articling, that was gutting to hear. Like, that was devastating, because I thought, my goodness, like, what have I gone and done? But I think it's back to what you were saying about the value of mentorship and really being able to connect with people further along. I don't mean to sound so pessimistic. There are blind people doing there are blind physicians. There's 100%. There's blind people all over the place doing incredible things. Yeah. But I think, what, information is power.
Yeah. 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 I'm looking forward to listening to this again, to kind of unpack your advice, because I think it's also useful for people setting realistic goals, perhaps, for themselves. And I think what your point about what do your life want to look like? What do you want your life to look like? I think that's kind of a critical part of career decision making as well, is what do you want that to look like, so that you can figure out how you can make that happen, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And in fairness, In fairness, it takes a long time to figure that out, right? And I think, at 18, and I feel like, so much of the research is continuously confirming that our brains are not even completely developed by the time we're 25. Like, I was an idiot in my 20s, like, right. And so like, I think too. Like it takes, thank goodness social media wasn't rampant then, right?
Totally.
Because we're so much more ideologically rigid, and we are just so much more outcomes focused and just so convinced that we have it figured out.
Yeah.
And so it does take a long time. But yeah, I think really thinking about that's exactly it. Yeah. Thinking about the kind of life you want and how hard you want to work. Right.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. This was an amazing conversation. I could spend another 45 minutes chatting, just so you know.
Likewise. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, we should do this again.
We'll make that happen.
Yeah, we should do this again. Wow, what a great conversation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Careers. If you liked this episode and want to hear more, follow us on Spotify and subscribe on YouTube. See you in the next one.